Hello, and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting an exciting new series. What if female Deku had Emitter Quirk? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by ashtonkaslana on fanfiction.net. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now, let's dive into the story. Midoriya, Izumi, a wonderful little girl, loved dearly by both her parents and adored by all those who knew her. The 5-year-old girl was a delight to be around, and far too smart for her own age, well known for her good manners as well as the kindness she showed to others. However, despite this, she was also a bit of mystery to those who spent time with her on a daily basis. Sort of a black sheep in a flock of white. The reason for this was because unlike most kids her age, she had yet to actually awaken her quirk. Her parents had taken her to see a doctor a few weeks after her 4th birthday. All the kids in her class had just about gotten their quirks, but hers hadn't appeared in any visible way as of yet. Flashback, 1 year. Interesting. The doctor mumbled as he looked over the results. On the other side of his desk sat Izumi Midoriya and Hisashi Midoriya, mother and father of Izumi Midoriya, who sat at her mother's lap. To be honest, I'm not too sure what is going on here. Is something wrong, doctor? Inko asked as she looked on worriedly. Honestly, she had become a bit more concerned when the doctor had come back a second and third time asking if he could run a few more tests just to verify the results of the first one. It didn't help that he hadn't been giving her or her husband any information after each test. No, there's nothing wrong per se. I'm just blown away by the results. At first I thought there may have been an error, but after running 3 different tests 3 times and getting the same results, there's no denying it. The doctor explained as he closed his files and turned to the Midoriya family with a smile. It helped calm the family a bit as it meant there wasn't bad news. The doctor then turned towards Izumi, the same smile, prompting the young child to smile shyly and wave with one hand while clutching the sleeve of her mother's top with her other hand. So, what exactly seems to be problem, doctor? Hisashi asked, not wanting to delay the topic any longer. Izumi still hasn't gotten her quirk despite turning 4 a few weeks ago. I can see why you would be concerned, but I assure you there's nothing wrong with your child. According to all the tests we've taken, Izumi not only has a quirk, but an extremely powerful one if the results from the tests are anything to go by. The doctor said to the excitement of Izumi and the relief of her parents. Both Inko and Hisashi knew how much their daughter wanted to be hero and how much that dream meant to her. It was all she ever spoke about ever since watching that video of All Might carrying multiple civilians on his back after saving them from a fire. They would have had it in them to tear apart that dream if she turned out not to have a quirk. Fortunately, they didn't have to worry about such a thing. After seeing the family calm down from the good news, the doctor continued his explanation. From what I can tell, she seems to have an emitter-type quirk, and her body shows signs of adapting to the quirk itself. The doctor explained as the family listened attentively. Most of the terms went over Inko's head, but Izumi and Hisashi were able to understand most of it. Her quirk factor alone is astonishing. It's far above the average. I don't think I've come across a quirk factor as strong as hers. With these readings, it's not surprising that her quirk has yet to actually manifest. It's merely too strong for her body right now. So, just to be sure, she does have a quirk. Inko asked once more. She was sure she understood most of what the doctor said, but a verbal confirmation would go a long way to easing her worries. Yes, and a powerful one at that. The strength of her quirk factor alone surpasses that most pro-heroes, even some of the top 10. The doctor said with a smile as Izumi grew more excited in her mother's lap and said, "Mother relaxed and smiled at her child. I would suggest keeping a closer eye on your child in the following months, anything from physical to mental changes. I don't expect her appearance to change since none of the tests we did indicated so, but even emitter-type quirks can cause drastic changes to the body. Of course, we'll bring her back if we notice anything." "Thank you, doctor," Hisashi said as he stood up and stretched his right hand to shake that of the doctor's. Inko merely bowed her head in thanks with little Izumi doing the same thing. The doctor gave Izumi a lollipop as the Midoriya family left, as a gift for being such a good patient. Weeks passed with no visible sign of Izumi's quirk manifesting, but the little girl still kept her hopes up. All her friends at school didn't believe her when she told them what the doctor had said, especially her childhood friend Katsuki Bakugu, whom she called Kachin. It seemed without the visible proof of her powers, they weren't going to believe she actually had a quirk. It didn't take long until she started to get alienated by others in elementary school as the quirkless freak, with Kachin being the ringleader of it all most of the time. Her former best friend, cause as much as it pained Izumi to admit, Kachin was no longer her friend. He had become arrogant under all the praise from their peers as well as the teachers. While Izumi had to admit that his quirk, it didn't give him the right to belittle those who he deemed beneath him. Worse yet, he had started to use his quirk to bully others. It wasn't until a year later, on the day of her 5th birthday, that her quirk finally manifested itself. It was a day that Izumi would remember not in fondness, but rather in grief and fear of herself and what she could do. It had started out just like any other day. The now 5-year-old Izumi woke up at 6 a.m., always the early bird, and immediately went for her computer. Her parents had quickly discovered that Izumi was something of a genius, far smarter than those of her age. It got to the point where they had even assumed she had an intelligence quirk of some kind. However, a quick visit to the quirk doctor proved otherwise. Still, they were more than willing to help their daughter cultivate this natural gift, and so they got her a computer. Izumi usually used it to search about the latest news on hero activities, so she could fill out her hero analysis book. She was already on volume 3, with the 3rd book almost finishing itself. Scrolling through the Japan's online news site, she saw the latest news was of an aquatic villain that had stuck the docks the previous night, only to be stopped by a very popular hero by the name of Gang Orca, who was also said to be one of the most villainous-looking heroes. Izumi didn't think it was a nice thing to say about him, though. He may seem intimidating at first glance, but research on him had shown he was a kind and gentle hero who had many kids, herself included, that looked up him, especially the mutant types that had less than ideal looks for one reason or another. Another hour and a half passed as she continued to browse through the hero forums, taking down as many detailed notes on hero and villain quirks for her hero analysis books. Izumi, time to get ready for school, she heard her father say as he opened the door to her room. He didn't even seem surprised to see her wide awake at 7:30 in the morning. Okay, Izumi said as she logged out of her accounts and switched to the computer and ran out the room. She made sure to say good morning to her father, giving him a kiss on the cheek once he crouched down to her level, before she ran to the bathroom where she knew her mother had prepared her bath by now and did the same with her. It was a routine in the Midoriya household that she was more than used to. She was happy to have such loving parents in her life. It certainly made the miserable days she was facing at school far more bearable. So, is anything interesting on the forums this morning? Inko asked as she placed a cup of coffee in front of her husband, who had a slice of toast in his mouth as he read a newspaper. Gang Orca stopped a group of villains that had attacked the docks last night, Izumi explained excitedly. Gang Orca, I heard that he's rising pretty fast in the hero rankings, Hisashi said as he took a drink from the coffee. Yeah, he's already almost in the top 20, ranking at 22nd, Izumi stated with a smile. He's also said to be one of the most villainous-looking heroes, although I think that's kind of mean. Izumi added with a pout. It does sound mean, but I can understand why some people would be intimidated by how he looks, Hisashi said with a shrug, only to flinch when Izumi suddenly glared at him. For a 5-year-old, his daughter had the devil's glare. Papa, that's not nice, Izumi shouted. Hisashi had the decency to look embarrassed while his wife giggled from her own seat on the table. How he looks shouldn't matter. It's not like he can help that his quirk is a mutant type. Sorry, little sprout. I wasn't trying to be rude or anything, her father said as he rubbed the back of his head nervously. Izumi wasn't sure if he was just apologizing for offending her or if he was apologizing for the comment towards Gang Orca, but she decided not to think about it too much and simply accepted the apology with a smile. The rest of breakfast went by quickly, with Izumi telling her parents the rest of the news articles that she'd read and a few of the quirks that she had written down in her hero analysis. She heard her parents discussing their plans for work as well, her father being an accountant for an established firm, and her mother being a lawyer for an upcoming law firm. Both her parents had demanding jobs, but they still always managed to make time just for her. And Izumi really appreciated this, and always did her best to be an independent child, so as to not trouble her parents unnecessarily. It wasn't much later that Izumi was dropped off at school by her mother. She did her best to avoid reacting to the strange looks that she got from her peers as they not so subtly whispered about her. "Hey, did you hear? Izumi still hasn't gotten her quirk." "What? But isn't she turning 5 soon?" "Maybe she doesn't have one. My daddy said people without quirks are called quirkless." Izumi's grip on the straps of her backpack tightened as she continued to walk to class. It was strange how cruel even elementary children could be towards each other. But in a world where quirks were almost everything, it shouldn't have been that surprising to her. Still, Izumi did her best to ignore all the cruel words and comments that came from those around her. She would get her quirk when the time was right. At least that's what she tried to tell herself. It was hard to remain optimistic when the world was against you, especially as a child. "Hey Deku, happy birthday." Her eyes widened in fear at the mocking and familiar voice that had spoken these words. She slowly turned her head and saw Kachin, Nobukagu, approaching with an arrogant grin plastered on his face, and his 2 lackeys following close behind. Izumi didn't really know their names, but she knew they both had mutant-type quirks, one that stretchy fingers and the other that had small wings on his back. That's right, it was her birthday today. She was almost certain that her parents were planning something for her today. Now that she actually thought about it, they had been acting far more casual than they usually did. Still, hearing Bakugu wish her happy birthday wasn't as comforting as it should have been. She had heard the mocking tone behind it, and knew that he was only getting started. Then there was the name Deku, which meant useless. It was a name branded on her by Bakugu after her quirk hadn't appeared a few months after she turned 4. A name that was now used by almost everyone in her class rather than her own name. It was a constant reminder that until she got her own quirk, they would all see her as nothing but a useless Deku. "It's already been a year, Deku. When is this powerful quirk of yours, huh?" Katsuki questioned tauntingly, causing Izumi to cow quietly, as she knew better than talk back to Bakugu when he was like this. "It was just one big lie, wasn't it, Deku? You really are just a useless, quirkless Deku, aren't you?" To think she'd lie about having a powerful quirk. Honestly, how pathetic can you get? One of Bakugu's friends said with a snicker as he looked at Izumi with no amount of sympathy. "It wasn't a lie." Izumi muttered lowly, her voice nothing but a whisper as she kept her head down, her eyes overshadowed by her hair. "What was that, Deku?" Bakugu asked in annoyance as he leaned in closer to her. "Come on, you're going to have to speak up if trash like you wants to be heard, Deku. Not that anyone wants to hear what a useless person like you has to say." The other kids, and even the teacher who had just entered, laughed at her, and Izumi felt tears gathering at the corner of her eyes. She kept her head down, though. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "All right, Bakugu, that's enough." The teacher spoke up as he told the other children to take their seats. Bakugu snorted as he turned away from Izumi and walking toward his seat. It was only after he was gone that she raised her head and wiped the tears in the corner of her eyes. She was used to this by now. She was pretty much the black sheep in a flock of white, and the other kids never failed to remind her of that, especially Bakugu. The teachers never did anything to stop them or protect Izumi, but instead they laughed alongside them and treated Izumi as if she was just an extra P&D of flesh in the school rather than a 5-year-old child. The school day quickly came to an end, and Izumi quickly and quietly slipped out of class before Katsuki and his goons would notice her. Slipping away had been easy enough, seeing as no one really bothered with her, except for Katsuki, of course, but that was for nothing but negative reasons. She held on to the straps of her bag as she began to walk home. She couldn't help but wonder to herself once more when all this would end. The discrimination, the bullying and isolation. All of it just because they thought she was quirkless wasn't fair. No, it wasn't right. One's lack of superpower shouldn't make them subject to this kind of life. Izumi couldn't help but wonder if this is how the remaining quirkless people all over the world were treated. If so, then there was clearly something wrong with the world. She didn't think she would ever be able to look at Bakugo and everyone else at school, teachers and students alike, the same way again. Even if she were to awaken her quirk today and they started treating her with smiles, she wouldn't be able to look past what she had endured over the past year. She wouldn't hate or spite any of them. She honestly didn't think she had it in her to hate someone unless they really deserved it. But she also wouldn't be able to forget everything so easily. Boom! Izumi's head snapped in the direction she had just heard that explosion, so fast that one might assume she had suffered a whiplash from that. She knew the sound of that explosion very well. How could she not? She had been on the receiving end of them for the past year. It was from Bakugo, that much there was no doubt. The fact that he was using his quirk so openly meant only one of two things. Either the blonde was showing off again and bragging about how awesome his quirk was and that he'd be the best hero, or he was once again bullying someone else and using his quirk to frighten them or worse harm them. Izumi couldn't help but frown as she realized just how far Bakugo had fallen in the last year alone, and it had all started when he got his quirk. He'd always been very passionate about being a hero, with both of them looking up to All Might, but it wasn't until after he got his quirk that he really changed. He changed from the confident, kind, and outgoing kid she called her best friend to this aggressive person within the blink of an eye. He looked down on everyone that was around him and didn't hesitate to hurt others with his quirk, especially those that he felt were looking down on him or those he viewed as a potential threat. As much as Izumi didn't want to be the target of Bakugo's rage, she also couldn't let someone else be hurt by her childhood friend. Besides, he was probably angry that she had managed to slip away and was now taking out his anger on someone else. So it was pretty much her fault that someone else was suffering in her place. With that thought in mind, Izumi's previously frozen body moved in the direction where she had heard the explosion coming from. She rounded the corner of a nearby building as, sure enough, she saw Bakugo and his two lackeys from earlier in class standing in front of a slightly bruised and injured boy their age with blonde hair and green eyes. Izumi recognized the boy as one of her classmates. He had a minor transformation quirk, if Izumi remembered correctly. It allowed him to change the color of his eyes based on his emotions. Not the most useful of quirks for heroics, and that alone made him a prime target for someone like Bakugo. Without further thought, the green-haired girl ran into the line of fire. "Stop it, Kachin!" Izumi shouted as she ran up and stood between Bakugo and his victim, her arms stretched as wide as possible in a defensive manner as she glared at the blonde. Though the tears gathering in the corner of her eyes and the way her body shook were clear indicators to the fear she felt in that moment. She couldn't help but flinch when Bakugo's red eyes shifted to her. "Get out of my way. This extra needs to learn his place." Katsuki growled before letting off a few explosions from his hand that made Izumi flinch instinctively. "Besides, what can you do to stop me, Deku? You don't even have a quirk." Izumi tried to ignore the way his lackeys laughed at her for that one, but she still felt a single tear slide down her left cheek. "I know I can't fight you, but I can at least stand in your way," Izumi declared. She knew she was playing a dangerous card that could literally blow up in her face, but right now she didn't care about herself. She was more worried about the injured boy in front of her. If that meant redirecting Katsuki's anger to her, then she was more than willing to pay that price. Hurting people isn't what a hero is supposed to do. Heroes save and help people. Izumi shouted as she remained grounded in her spot with her arms spread out. She would probably regret this later today as she walked home with a limp and numerous burns, but at least she'd have protected the other boy from harm. "What? Are you calling me a villain, Deku?" Bakugo shouted as he glared at the green-haired girl spitefully, setting off some slightly larger explosions that frightened her. Clearly her words had been misinterpreted, and she found herself in a slightly more troublesome position. "And no, that's a no, what is saying at all, Kachin?" Izumi said frantically as she waved her arms in front of her as she slowly backed away out of fear of what the blonde would do to her. Casting a quick glance behind her, Izumi noticed that Bakugo's initial victim had taken the opportunity to escape. That was one less thing she had to worry about at least. Now she just had to avoid dying at the hands of an explosive 5-year-old boy. It's just that H-heroes are supposed to people and help them, not hurt them for no reason. The green-haired girl didn't know what was going through her mind even as she shouted those words, and she was certain she would be regretting them seconds later. But she wanted to show the blonde that she once saw as friend that what he was doing was plain wrong. "Oh, I see now. You think you're better than me, Deku. That just because you're helping some pathetic extra that makes you a hero," Bakugo yelled as he took a step towards Izumi. The green-haired girl instinctively crossed her arms in front of her defensively, and rightfully so too. As not a second later her blonde aggressor moved both his arms forwards and released a large explosion towards Izumi. The girl screamed as the heat from the explosion burned in her crossed arms, the left side of her midsection and the right side of her face. Her arms had suffered the worst damage, having taken most of the damage, having third-degree burns and bleeding, while her torso and face only had somewhere between first and second-degree burns. The force of the explosion in itself had been enough to knock Izumi off her feet as she roughly fell on the ground, rolling a few times before she coming to a stop on her front side. It hurt. Izumi could barely register anything beyond the excruciating pain that she felt from all over her body. Bakugo had never hurt her this badly before. Sure, he had used his quirk on her before, left a few burns here and there that had required her to go to the nurse's office, though the school always wrote down false reasons for her injuries. But this was the first time he had hurt her, as much as he had today. And as Izumi looked up at the blonde bully once more, her view of him changed completely. She looked up to Bakugo for all her life, which wasn't long, given her age. He'd always been the braver and more outgoing between the two of them, and they had both shared the dream of wanting to become heroes like All Might. But looking at the unrepentant grin plastered on his face, as his hands twitched and smoke from the explosion he had just released, a clear sign he hadn't held anything back this time. It was then that she realized something that she had been denying ever since he had started treating her this way. Bakugo wasn't her friend anymore. At least, not the blonde bully she saw in front of her. Friends didn't hurt each other or insult each other the way he had been doing to her since he got his quirk, especially to the extent at which he had hurt her. With that revelation came fear. If Bakugo didn't see her as a friend, then he really had no reason to pull any punches. Izumi had held on to the belief that even if the blonde was willing to hurt her, he hadn't done anything excessive because the two of them had been friends. But that thought was squashed away today, not just by the severity of her injuries and the pain that she felt, but also by the fear she felt from the menacing grin that was on the blonde's face. Know your place, Deku. You think helping these weaklings makes you some kind of hero? You're worse than all these extras. At least they have quirks. I'd be doing the world a favor if I got rid of your quirkless, but... Bakugo yelled with a maniac grin as he looked down at the injured and burned figure of the green-haired girl. Bakugo, I think you may have taken it too far this time. The stretchy fingers Goon commented as he glanced at Izumi's injuries, in particular her bleeding arms and midsection. This was beyond the small burns the blonde usually left on the girl, and he was sure they would get into a lot of trouble because of it. However, judging by the glare the blonde sent his way, he didn't seem to share his concerns. Shut it. If you want to chicken out, then go ahead, but I'm not done yet. Bakugo growled before turning his focus back to Izumi, small explosions being released from his hands that had recovered a bit from the earlier backlash. I'm tired of Deku always getting in my way, looking down on me, muttering and lying. When I'm through with her, she'll wish she was dead. Izumi, who lay on the ground, crying and doing her best to resist touching the extremely painful burns on her arms, looked towards the blonde in nothing but utter fear, her body paralyzed and voice stuck in her throat. Hadn't he already done enough? Couldn't he see that she was already in a lot of pain and that her injuries were abnormal? The fact that he spoke so casually about killing her, making it seem as though he'd be doing society a favor, made it clear to Izumi just how much of a danger Bakugo was, especially to her. As the blonde walked towards her, small explosions going off in his right hand, Izumi felt her BLD run cold. The burns all over her body burned 1,000 times hotter all of a sudden. Her hearing and sense of touch were lost to her, as all she could hear and feel was her heart beating at an abnormally rapid pace. Her eyes narrowed, as the only thing she could see was the black figure of Katsuki Bakugo with glowing red eyes walking toward her, its palms sparking and smoking with explosions that were just waiting to be unleashed. And so the 5-year-old girl did the only thing she could do in that moment where her heart was filled with terror unlike any other. She screamed. And with that scream came the beginning of a new chapter in her life. To one Katsuki Bakugo, 1 second he had been walking towards Izumi, who was battered, bruised, and bleeding, shaking in fear as her eyes looked up at him. He intended to drive the lesson home, maybe a pop or two with his explosions, just so it would stick. Even he could tell that any more drastic actions, and she might actually keel over. Something that he didn't want looming over him despite his own words. And yet before the blonde could say another word, or get his point across, Izumi suddenly let out such a loud and terrified scream that even Katsuki took a step back in shock and was forced to cover his ears from it all. The blonde was further surprised when a white aura began to grow brightly around Izumi's body, prompting the blonde to cover his eyes as the lighter grew brighter and brighter, engulfing him. He could vaguely hear the screams of various people, children and parents alike, as they fled the scene. Katsuki knew he should have done so too, or at the very least made some distance between him and Deku, and yet he was frozen in shock as he looked at Izumi. Barely seeing Trough the light, the blonde was surprised to see the burns and injuries he'd left on Izumi just minutes ago begin to heal at a rapid pace from bottom to top. The sphere of light that was surrounding her slowly began to glow brighter and grow larger in its size, and it seemed to have the strangest effect on their surroundings. Grass and flowers began to grow all around them. Vines with colorful flowers along them sprouted from the ground and began to wrap around whatever object was closest to them. Trees, benches, people, and other things across the park. Katsuki wasn't quite sure, but he was willing to bet that this effect was going beyond just the playground they were at right now. Before the blonde could ponder further on what was going on, he felt his suddenly become very heavy. His arms went limp at his sides, his legs could barely carry his own weight, and his eyes became heavy with fatigue and sleepiness. He vaguely felt himself fall to his knees as he turned to look at Izumi one last time. There was no doubt in his mind to what was going on right now. It was a DMN quirk awakening. Either that or Izumi had been hiding her quirk from everyone for the past year. But even he wasn't stupid enough to believe the latter. Bakugo honestly had no idea how to feel about that. Izumi really had been a late bloomer after all. This thought remained with him even as he fell forward, eyes finally closing as he lost the last of his consciousness. There was no use denying what was in front of him. He may not know what Izumi's quirk is, but he can tell that it was badass, just as she had said it would. Looks like I was the villain after all. Bakugo thought to himself as the last of his energy left his body and the world went black. It wasn't until much later that Izumi started to regain consciousness. She opened her eyes and rubbed them with her eyes in order to clear the drowsiness. The first thing she noticed was that she was in a partially lit that was still mostly dark. The smell of medicine and chemicals in the air quickly clued Izumi to the fact that she was in a hospital room. She sat up on the bed she just realized she was on. It was also then that she noticed her state of dress. The clothes she had been wearing earlier that day had all been replaced with a plain white hospital gown, further cementing where she thought she was. Looking around the room for a moment, Izumi quickly noticed the sleeping figure of her mother in the chair next to her bed. The older woman was leaning back into the seat with her head resting against its top left corner. Looking over to the digital clock placed on the wall in front of her bed, Izumi realized it was a few minutes past midnight, meaning that she had been unconscious for more than a couple of hours. Looking back at her mother, Izumi frowned sadly as she turned back to her mother. She knew her mom had to have been worried a great deal, and probably had the closest thing to a heart attack when she heard her daughter had been hospitalized. Izumi wouldn't be too surprised if her mother had cried the usual waterworks when she got to the hospital. Izumi tried to recall how she had ended up in the hospital of all places. Her memory of the earlier today were a bit hazy, but she clearly remembered leaving school only to intervene when she saw another kid being bullied by Bakugo and his 2 lackeys. She remembered getting severely burned by the blonde and the pain she felt in that moment. Strangely enough, she didn't feel any pain right now, though, and she certainly didn't have any injuries on her body, Must have been the work of someone with a healing quirk amongst the hospital staff. The last thing she truly remembered was burning sensation that she had felt throughout her whole body as a bright light filled her vision. Her initial thought was that it was just the memory of Bakuga's attacks on her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this sensation had come from within her rather than from outside. She remembered feeling that heat deep within her chest. But in that moment, it was overshadowed from the immense pain she felt as a result of Bakuga's explosions. Before she knew it, it exploded within her, spreading from her core to every inch of her body. The tips of her toes and fingers, the top of her head, and even her hair, no part of her remained untouched by that inner burn. And yet now that she was calm and processing, she realized that it had never actually hurt. Despite feeling like there had been a fire touching every corner of her body, that burning sensation strangely didn't hurt at all. If anything, it had been comforting and kind of empowering. Even now, she felt just fine. No, she felt better than fine. She felt as though she had been reborn or something. Her body felt as light as a feather, and she felt as though she had the energy to go on for days without rest. Izumi didn't know what was going on with her, and that scared her to an extent, despite having the feeling that she shouldn't be afraid. And so the little girl did the only thing she could think of in that moment. She turned to her mother and reached out to her, gently shaking the elder Midoriya awake. "Mom," Izumi called as she pushed against her mother's shoulder. It took a few tries, but eventually Inko's eyes began to flutter open as she turned to the source of the disturbance. "Izumi," Inko questioned as she rubbed her eyes and switched on the light next to the bed. It took a few seconds for her to realize what she had just said and the fact that her daughter was awake and seated on the bed right in front of her. Before Izumi could even get a word, her mother had already jumped from her seat and pulled her into a bone-crushing hug. "My baby," the elder woman wailed as tears poured out like a fountain from her eyes. Mom, I'm fine. Mom, I'm fine." Izumi managed to squeal. She had expected this reaction from her mother. It was typical of her to worry over every little detail, even if there was nothing to be worried about. Izumi didn't particularly mind. It was just her mother being overly affectionate, and a clear sign that she loved her daughter. "Are you sure? You're not hurting anywhere?" Inko asked as she pulled away from the tight embrace and looked her daughter up and down, checking for any signs of discomfort. "The doctor said you weren't injured when you brought in, only extremely tired, but I still can't help but worry." Inko mumbled as she took in her daughter's hands in her own and held them firmly. The relief in her eyes was apparent. It was then her eyes widened. "I should probably let the nurses know that you're awake," Inko said as she stood up from the bed and reached the phone that was attached to the wall nearby. In doing so, she missed the way Izumi frowned once her mother's gaze was turned from her. She couldn't help but wonder what her mother meant when she said Izumi had been admitted into the hospital without any injuries. She was more than certain that Katsuki had left her with enough burns to actually leave visible scars this time around. She had originally thought that a nurse or doctor with a powerful healing quirk had been the one to tend her wounds, but her mother was saying otherwise. That left Izumi with a lot more questions than she had answers to. "Izumi," Inko called out, once more pulling Izumi from her thoughts. The child noticed the worried expression that her mother had on her face and realized that she must have been making a weird face. "Are you okay?" Inko asked as she sat on the bed once more and pulled her daughter into her side. "My body just feels a bit weird," Izumi explained as she leaned into her mother's left side. It wasn't a lie. Her body really did feel different than usual. "Mom, what happened to me?" Izumi asked as she looked at Inko from the corner of her eyes. "There was an incident that occurred at the playground you were playing at. I'm not too sure about the details, but it's been all over the news since noon," Inko said as she held Izumi's hand in her own while gently caressing the smaller hand with her thumb. "Your father and I were called from our respective jobs by the police, and we rushed to the hospital as soon as we were made aware of the fact that you had been admitted." Izumi looked around but didn't see her father anywhere, nor any sign that he had been in the room. Inko noticed this and smiled as she rubbed her daughter's arm soothingly. "Your father stuck around for about 2 hours, but had to get back to work. Though the reassurance from the doctors that you would make a full recovery by tomorrow morning was reassuring," Inko explained as Izumi nodded her head. She knew that her dad was very often busy with his work, so it's no surprise. Knock knock. Before the conversation between mother and daughter could go on, a knock at the door interrupted them. Inko called for whoever was on the other side, most likely the doctor, to come on in. And sure enough, a tall, orange-eyed lady with lime green hair, dressed in a lab coat and a stethoscope around her neck, walked in, and following closely behind her was a nurse that was held a notepad in her hands. The doctor's eyes quickly landed on Izumi before a warm and gentle smile graced her face, one that caused Izumi to blush and look down as her bed sheets suddenly became that much more interesting. "Dr. Sakaguchi? I didn't know you were still at work," Ink said as she stood up from the bed and greeted the nurse and doctor. She recognized the doctor as the one who had been keeping an eye on Izumi's condition throughout the day. "Yes, well, today is actually my 24-hour shift, so when you notified the nurses that your daughter had woken up, I was immediately notified and decided to come myself to tend to her," the now identified Dr. Sakaguchi said with a smile, to while Inko bowed her head in gratitude towards the doctor, only for her to wave it off by saying that it was her job. The doctor then took the notepad from the nurse and looked over what Izumi could only assume were her statistics. "Though I must admit, it was faster than I was expecting. I wasn't expecting you to wake until late in the morning." Looking up from a notepad, she then walked towards Izumi's bed and approached the nervous greenhead, though the reassuring smile from her mother helped soothe Izumi's nerves. The doctor spoke softly and gently, so as to not scare Izumi. "Hello, Izumi. My name is Dr. Sakaguchi. I'm a doctor that's been taking care of you since you were brought in." "Hello." Izumi managed to stutter before she bowing her head in gratitude. "Thank you for taking care of me." The gratitude surprised the doctor, if the way her eyes widened and she covered her mouth. "Oh my, such a well-mannered child," Dr. Sakaguchi said with a laugh before turning a side glance towards Inko. "You must be proud." Inko smiled at the praise before the doctor turned back to Izumi. "Now, Izumi, can you tell me if your body feels tired or painful anywhere, if you feel strange or different in any part of your body? I'm going to run some tests anyway, but anything you can tell me would be very helpful. I don't really feel tired or any pain," Izumi said after a few seconds of self-inspection. She could move her arms and fingers just fine, her feet and legs too. "I see," Dr. Sakaguchi said as she wrote something down on the notepad after watching Izumi move her arms and legs. "But have you noticed anything strange or different about your body?" Izumi took a moment to think about the doctor's words. It was oddly specific. Still, she didn't mind answering. She told the doctor about how her body somehow felt lighter and stronger than she remembered. Nothing major, but enough that Izumi had noticed. She spoke of the pool of warmth she could feel deep within her. "Interesting. Now, Izumi, from what I've read of medical records, your quirk has yet to come in, yes?" The doctor asked as Izumi subconsciously flinched at the topic, something that was not missed by all three adults in the room. Inko decided to step up and speak up. "Yes, a little under a year ago, we went to a quirk doctor to see if there was a problem. We were told that Izumi had a very strong quirk factor and that her quirk would most likely come in later than most as a result." Inko explained with a frown as she wondered where this was going. "Yes, that checks out with everything I have here. We'll have to actually run a few tests to confirm how strong her quirk factor is, but given the incident today, I think it's safe enough to assume her quirk is indeed powerful," the doctor explained as Inko and Izumi looked at her in mild confusion. The doctor noticed this and shook her head sideways. "It looks like I jumped the gun a little. First things first, I guess I should congratulate you on finally awakening your quirk, Izumi," Dr. Sakaguchi went on to say with a wide smile, as the eyes of both Izumi and Inko widened as they processed the doctor's words. "Am I true quirk?" Izumi stuttered as she tried to grasp just what the doctor had said. Sure, she had suspected that it may have been the cause, the intense heat and pain she felt in her body before blacking out, and the way her body felt lighter and stronger after waking up in the hospital with the pool of warmth deep within her. Those were clear indicators that something within her had changed, but she'd quickly quashed the notion before she could get her hopes up. After a year of hoping and waiting for her quirk, of being the laughingstock of her class, she hadn't wanted to get her hopes up only for them to get destroyed once more. I finally have a quirk. Izumi asked in disbelief, as tears immediately began to pour out of her eyes despite the smile that was on her face. Inko immediately rushed to the bed and pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, one that was returned by the child, as she congratulated Izumi whilst crying some herself. Inko knew how much this moment meant to her daughter. Though Izumi had tried hard to hide it from her parents, Inko knew that she was having a hard time at school because of her quirkless nature over the last year. But Izumi had insisted she was fine with a big smile every time the topic was brought off and would brush their concerns aside with a smile. She also knew that Izumi wanted to be a hero when she grew up. And while the thought scared her, since she didn't want to watch her daughter ever get hurt, she knew that not giving her daughter the support she wanted would crush her even more. That wasn't something she was willing to do. I'm sorry to intrude on such a moment, but unfortunately, the awakening. Dr. Sakaguchi said after the mother and daughter had calmed down a little bit. But unfortunately, the awakening of Izumi's quirk was the cause of the incident that occurred this afternoon. As a result, there are some police officers that have been waiting to speak with her the moment she wakes up. Does that mean I'm in trouble? Izumi asked with a slight amount of fear as Inko immediately narrowed her eyes. Why is this the first I'm hearing of this? First, I wasn't aware that my daughter's quirk had awakened and was the cause of the incident, and now you're telling me there are police officers that want to interrogate her. Inko asked as she stood up from the bed while glaring at the doctor. I'm sorry for withholding that information, but I was asked not to say anything until the police had a chance to speak with your daughter as soon as she woke up. The doctor said sincerely with another bow of her head. Is she going to be in any trouble? Surely they understand that this was an accident. Inko asked as she became slightly concerned. I don't think you need to worry about her being in trouble. Not only is Izumi still a minor, but this was a quirk manifestation. There have been far worse incidents than this one that occurred due to similar circumstances. The doctor said with a reassuring smile that put Inko and Izumi at ease. Besides, your daughter's quirk did far more good than harm in any measure. The news channels and social media are referring to as a miracle even, she added with a small laugh as Izumi and Inko looked at her in mild confusion. In all the happiness and joy of Izumi having a quirk, the two of them had forgotten to ask the most important question of all. What was Izumi's quirk? Izumi was glad that she wasn't in any real trouble and that she hadn't caused any real trouble with her quirk. But it only brought about more questions and answers. The fact that it was being called a miracle of all things really made her wonder what she had done. Excuse me, Dr. Sakaguchi, Izumi called out, garnering the attention of the adults in the room. Can I ask what my quirk is? Inko also turned to the doctor with an inquisitive glance, as she too was curious as to what her daughter's quirk was. Ah, if it's all the same to both of you, I'd like the police to be here when I give that explanation to avoid repeating myself. Dr. Sakaguchi requested. Inko and Izumi turned to each other for a moment, the young child nodding her head nervously to show she was okay with it. I suppose that works fine with us, Inko said as she nodded her head towards the doctor, who nodded her head in thanks before turning to the nurse beside her. Can you bring them in? The doctor said, to which the nurse nodded her head before exiting the room. Inko and the nurse began conversing about Izumi's current condition while the child in question allowed her mind to wander. She didn't know what she had done with her quirk, but the fear of being in trouble was overshadowed by the excitement of finally having a quirk of her own, a power that was uniquely hers. She already knew from what the quirk analyst and Dr. Sakaguchi said that it was something powerful, and it had to be something good if the media was describing the incident caused by its awakening as a miracle. Knock, knock. Izumi was pulled out of her exciting thoughts by the sound of the door being knocked on. Dr. Sakaguchi went and opened the door before stepping aside as two individuals walked in, one dressed in a black trouser, a white formal shirt, and a black coat, the other the standard police uniform. Thank you for being patient with us, officers, the doctor said as the officers walked into the room. She gestured towards Inko and Izumi and introduced them. This is Izumi Midoriya, mother of the child in question, and next to her is Izumi, who awakened her quirk today. At the doctor's last statement, the two officers turned their gaze towards the little girl who was quick to grasp her mother's arm at the sudden attention being directed her way. Detective Kayabashi, the man in the cloak, introduced himself. Officer Fujima, thank you for your time. The policeman said with a quick bow of his head. Seems like he was the jumpy type. Detective, do you mind taking it from here? The doctor requested. Of course. Kayabashi said before coughing into his right hand. Now, before we start, I want to state that the young girl Izumi is in no way in any trouble. We've just come looking for answers. Quirk awakening incidences happen all the time, but there are very few that happen on such a large scale. Fortunately, no one got hurt. If anything, it was the opposite. Inko seemed to relax slightly at this, the grip she had on Izumi's hand loosening. Izumi herself seemed to become less nervous in front of the two officers. While Dr. Sakaguchi had assured them before that Izumi's quirk awakening had not been a negative one, but one that positively impacted many people, some even calling a miracle, the presence of police officers couldn't help but make the Midoriya feel like Izumi was in some sort of trouble. Kayabashi then took out a notepad and began to read. Based on the reports that we gathered, Izumi awakened her quirk in the park near her elementary school. The effect was a bright light emanating from her body, followed by various plants and flowers sprouting from the ground around her. The surprising part is that the plant growth didn't end just at the park, but rather stretched around her in a 2-block radius. Kayabashi explained, surprising Inko, and while Izumi didn't quite understand the distance, she knew it had to be far. The surprise doesn't end there, though. From numerous witness reports, glowing flowers started sprouting along the vines, and that's when the miracle happened. Those that were touched from the glow of the flowers were healed, re-energized, or positively changed in one way or another. Those disabled or crippled being restored to full health. The elderly regained a fraction of their youth, and various other illnesses that were considered incurable by modern medicine, or even the healing quirks currently available, were all healed under the power of young Izumi's quirk. Inko was shocked, and if she was being honest, a bit scared too. Her daughter had such a powerful quirk, and at such a young age, she knew that Izumi always wanted to be a hero, and with this she could be. But what truly worried her was how other people would react to knowing she had such a powerful healing quirk, and how they might try to exploit or influence her. To be honest, even I found this revelation shocking myself. After running some tests, I was actually surprised by the density of her quirk factor. It's unlike anything I've ever seen in a child. Dr. Sakaguchi said, drawing Inko's attention once more. Yes, the quirk specialist we took her to see last year after her quirk didn't come and said that it was comparable to the factors of pro heroes, maybe even those in the top 10. Inko said with a smile. That is indeed the case. The doctor said with a nod before turning to the officers in the room. I ran some tests after measuring her factor and was able to come up with an idea of what her quirk is. Obviously, it's an emitter, and based on the results, it's a quirk that allows her to manipulate vital energy, otherwise known as life energy, hence the mass healing and plant life growth with her at the epicenter. The extent of said manipulation is still unknown, but we can expect it to be quite powerful given the awakening process, and it will most likely grow stronger as time passes. This next part is only speculation, but I suspect that Izumi has a massive pool of said life energy within her, a wellspring, if you will. As a matter of fact, I'd say she's had it since she was 4, meaning her quirk was already present. She just needed a catalyst in order to be able to draw upon this special power. That's a lot to take in, Doctor, the detective said as he tried to write down as much as he could. Izumi, being the young quirk analyst she was, had understood almost everything the doctor had said and had loved the sound of it all. A quirk that basically allowed her to manipulate life energy with a large power source deep within her. What wasn't to like about that? She could already envision the numerous ways that she could use a power like that to save lives and be a hero. If she took inspiration from various energy manipulating heroes that she had seen, she could potentially make offensive and defensive moves. She might even be able to make weapons or things like that. A lot of it is only speculation, but there is no telling what truly is, only that it falls along the lines of life energy. Dr. Sakaguchi said with a sigh, you mentioned earlier that she may have had this power for a long time now, and that it may have been released by a trigger or, in your words, catalyst. Officer Fujima stated, to which the doctor nodded. The officer then turned towards Izumi and Inko. Mrs. Midoriya, I hope you don't mind me asking your daughter a question or two pertaining the last thing she remembers before her quirk awakening. Inko looked to her daughter, who seemed more than fine now, happy even. More than likely as a result of hearing about her quirk. Inko had initially been worried about what consequences of her daughter having such a powerful quirk would be, and she would be lying if she said she still wasn't. But she was more hopeful about her daughter's future more than anything now. She could see how happy Izumi was just by hearing that her quirk had finally awoken, and the fact that it was such a diverse and powerful power was just a boost. With her drive and higher-than-average intelligence, Izumi was bound to go far with this power. Inko would be a horrible mother if she were to stop her daughter's dream out of her own worries and concerns. She would just have to do her best to support Izumi's dreams. I'm sure it's okay, right, Izumi? Inko asked as she placed an encouraging hand on Izumi's back. Izumi, while slightly nervous, still nodded her head in response, prompting Inko to do the same with a smile. Thank you, the officer said before turning to the young child. He did his best to come off as an approachable person to the child so as to not intimidate her. Izumi, can you tell us the last thing that you remember before you fell asleep from overusing your quirk? It might help us understand what triggered your quirk and would also help us take precautions to make sure something like that doesn't happen again. At the question, Izumi's body seemed to freeze as a look of dread appeared on her face. They wanted her to talk about what he had done to her in the park. In that moment, Izumi felt her entire body begin to burn again from the phantom pain of the injuries she had gotten from Bakugo earlier that day. Her body was all healed up, but she could feel that pain as if the burns were still there. I can't, Izumi stammered out as she began to shake in fear, her arms wrapping around herself defensively as her breathing became rather ragged and panicked. Izumi, Inko immediately called out in worry as she placed her hands on her daughter's shoulders in an attempt to draw her attention. Izumi, dear, what's wrong? But it was no use. Izumi's mind had already spiraled. Her mind was no longer in the hospital room. She was back to that moment once more. In the park and in the ground, her body burning with the injuries she had sustained from Bakugo's explosions. The blonde staring down at her with a huge predatory grin and demonic red eyes. Izumi was quickly snapped out of her spiraling thoughts when she felt an enveloping warmth surround her being. Blinking a few times, she was back within the hospital room with her mother holding her in a tight embrace. Izumi clutched on her mother and began to cry, burying her face in her mother's bosom. Inko merely held her, petting her head and rubbing her back for comfort. She turned towards the doctor and officers. I think we should hold off any questioning for the time being. Clearly, whatever happened impacted her heavily. Inko suggested, though everyone could tell it wasn't really a suggestion. That may be for the best, whatever. Hapdash. Mrs. Midoriya. The sudden alarm shout from Dr. Sakaguchi cut off Detective Kayabashi, prompting him to look where the mother and daughter were, and what he saw shocked and terrified him deeply. Inko had fallen on her left side on the bed, clutching her midsection as she groaned in pain, clearly fighting of the longing to scream. Her skin had turned a disturbing shade of gray and was continuing to get worse, black tendril-like markings spreading across the visible parts of her arms and legs as they also became darker in color. Izumi, who had been hugging her mother, was now stuck frozen once more, her eyes shifting between the pained and deteriorating figure of her mother and her own hands, which seemed to be emitting some kind of black smoke or something. She had felt something cool, almost cold, surging under her skin while she had been hugging her mother, a tingling sensation at the edge of her fingers. But seeking the comfort and warmth of her mother after being reminded of the events that afternoon, she pushed those feelings aside and instead embraced her mother tighter, seeking more warmth to counter the cold she felt circulating within her. Mrs. Midoriya. Izumi barely heard the doctor shout, barely saw her move as she tended to her mother. She was still trying to process what she had just done, looking at the black smoke still emanating from her hands, growing thicker and slowly larger as her emotions spiraled downhill. She knew she was the one that had hurt her mother in such a terrible and horrible way. Was this another ability of her quirk? She was torn from her thoughts when the pained cries of her mother ceased, and the room suddenly became so quiet. She turned her head just in time to see the doctor, who had been trying to help her mom, step away from the now unmoving and extremely pale body of her mother. Why had she stopped? Couldn't he see that she still looked very sick, that her skin had mostly turned white, that those black tendril-like markings were still all over her body? Why had she stopped? Could he see that she wasn't moving, that her chest wasn't even rising and falling? Did that mean she wasn't breathing? Why wasn't the doctor doing something? "She's gone," Dr. Sakaguchi announced, her voice low but still loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Izumi's BLD went cold. That cooling sensation she had felt earlier spreading across her entire body like a wildfire, bubbling beneath the surface of her skin, just begging for release. "I did this. I killed Mom." Izumi was struggling to come to terms with what had just happened, tears streaming down her eyes as she looked at the now lifeless corpse of her mother. The reality of what she had just done crashed down on her with the force of a tidal wave. And with that reality check came a wave of horror and grief so great that Izumi once more lost control of her recently awakened power. The cries and reassurances of the cops and doctor fell on deaf ears as a massive amount of black smoke erupted from her body. The last thing the young child heard was their screams of agony, the hospital alarm systems turning on, and the panicked voices of various other people. Little did she know that she had unleashed a terror so great that this night would forever be remembered by many as the night of the Black Plague. July 15th, 2142, that was the day in which two major events had occurred within the precinct of Mizudafu Precinct. Two events that changed the lives of many people in that area for better and for worse. The first event happened around midday. A bright emerald green light centered around one of the central parks erupted and spread outwards in a 4-block radius, and bioluminescent plants, flowers, and trees sprouted from the ground. But the truly miraculous thing was the effect of the light and glowing plant life. Many who were touched by this light found themselves getting miraculously healed, rejuvenated, and even deaging to a very small extent. Those crippled or deformed were healed to a state of perfection. The elderly regained a few years of youth, and any ailments they had due to their old age, such as backaches, suddenly vanished as if they'd never existed in the first place. This miraculous event lasted 10 minutes. The light and plant life vanished just as quickly appeared. On the other hand, on the night of the very same day, an hour after midnight, another incident occurred at the Mizudafu Central Hospital. It came suddenly. A burst of black smoke suddenly filled one of the higher building floors. Numerous screams and cries for help were heard as the smoke continued to spread both upwards and downwards, leaking out the hospital windows and entrances into the streets below. All those that came into contact with this smoke suffered from various effects, be it various forms of disease, the decay and rot of flesh, rapid aging, and even instant death. There was no mercy for any who came in contact with the smoke, regardless of size and age. This terror lasted for approximately 5 minutes, and the black mist reached the streets below and spread across a 2-block radius, before coming to a stop and dispersing just as quickly as it appeared. Despite the brief PRD of the event, many lives were taken that night, and many more were negatively impacted by the effects of the smoke. There were few survivors who came out unscathed, those with healing or regenerative quirks, few with mutant-type quirks, and others just lucky enough to have not been affected. The reason for this was still unknown. The disaster went on to be called the Black Plague. It was assumed that this disaster was the work of a villain. Whether it was the work of a quirk or some kind of bomb was still unknown, but it was assumed to be some kind of large-scale terrorist attack. The heroes and police forces had been adamant about finding the perpetrators and bringing them to justice. And yet, even after nearly a whole year, the authorities were no closer to finding the people responsible. July 14th, 2143. For one young Izumi Midoriya, her life had changed drastically since that day, the day her quirk had awakened. The most obvious being that her mother was no longer with her, having passed away on the night of the Black Plague. But Izumi knew better. Her mother had not simply passed away. She had been killed, and Izumi had been the one to do it. Not just her either. She was responsible for all the deaths that night, as well as the numerous lives affected as a result of the Black Plague. And that was a burden and guilt she'd have to live with and carry for the rest of her life. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on perspective, nobody seemed to realize that she was the one responsible for the incident. The conclusion being that she was one of the few that had come out unscathed due to her powerful healing abilities that had awakened earlier that day. She remembered her father coming to the hospital branch the survivors had been transferred to the following morning, and how happy and relieved he had been to see her well and alive, hugging her with a tight embrace. But she also remembered how broken he looked when news of Inko's passing reached him. He looked devastated and for a moment broken too, but by the time he had turned back to her, he was smiling gently once more, even if the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He reassured her that they would be okay, told her that it would be hard, but they would manage. Izumi couldn't bring herself to tell him at that moment, to tell him that it was her fault that her mother died. Izumi went through a lot in the days that followed, her mind still trying to process everything that had happened. The weight of being responsible for what happened weighed heavily on her, so much so that she cried and cried. Her father merely assumed she was crying for her mother, and did his best to reassure her that they would be fine. Holding onto her tightly as he cried with her, Izumi didn't dare hug him back, afraid that if she did so he would also disappear, just as her mother had. A week later they carried out Inko's funeral. Izumi barely remembered the event. Everything had been a blur. Her mother had been an orphan from what she remembered, so there was no family from her side, and her father didn't really keep in touch with his side. In the end, it was a small funeral with close friends and some workmates. In the weeks that followed, Izumi didn't return to school, a request that she made to her father, too afraid to be around many people without a better understanding of her quirk. She had been afraid to use it, afraid that she may hurt someone again, but being the little genius she was, Izumi understood that she couldn't just run from this power. It was a part of her now. She had to learn how to control it, so she didn't accidentally hurt anyone else. Otherwise, she may do more harm in the future as her quirk grew stronger. And so with the help of her father, Izumi applied for online classes, so she wouldn't be left behind in her studies. The best part about this setup was that Izumi could study at her own pace and at her own hours because the materials were readily available online. Because of that, Izumi spent most of her free time either analyzing quirks or practicing and exploring her quirk. Of course, she did this in an isolated and faraway environment. She remembered the first time she tried actively using her power. Flashback, 5 months ago. Little Izumi found herself deep within the woods outside of Mizutofu. She may have ventured a bit too far in the wilderness, but she still felt it was for the best. At least this way no one would get hurt if she failed to control her quirk. Just the thought of what happened 6 months ago was enough to bring tears to the corner of her eyes. No, she muttered to herself as she shook her head sideways. Mama wouldn't want me to blame myself. I just have to do better. I have to learn to control my quirk so I can use it to save people, not hurt them. Despite her age and the tragedy she went through, Izumi still aspired to be a hero. She hadn't given up on that dream. If anything, she was only further driven to achieve her dream so she could make her mother proud. Her parents had been the only ones to believe in her after a year of her quirk not coming in. Her mother had even said she could become a hero without a quirk when Izumi had started to doubt if she would get a quirk herself. So she can't give up now. And so Izumi had spent most of her free time over the last week researching emitter-type quirks, which she suspected hers fell under. The reason being she hadn't been able to call on her power since she had awakened it. She didn't understand why, but after her research, she felt she had a better understanding of why she couldn't access her power. According to the forums she'd read online, most emitter-type quirks seem to have a center, a core if you will, one that the user should be able to feel and access at will. Most of the advice she read was just about searching for that metaphorical core, and maybe attempting to remember how she felt when she first used it. And so that was why she was out here today. She was going to attempt to reach out to the source within her. She made sure she was deep within the forest just in case her power exploded like it did on that day. Okay, let's do this, Izumi said as she sat down on the grass. She had found a small clearing within the woods that was close to a small river. She had decided that this spot was both far. She sat down, legs crossed, and brought her hands above her knees. She had looked into some meditation practices for this particular situation, wanting to achieve the best results possible as soon as possible. Taking a deep breath, the 5-year-old child closed her eyes and tried to clear her mind of all unnecessary thoughts. Her mind went back to the day she awakened her quirk, to the first time she had unleashed it while in the park. Back then, she remembered feeling terrified of Katsuki Bakugo. Her body had been severely injured by his explosion quirk, and the blonde seemed keen on doing more. At that moment, she had acknowledged that the blonde who was once her friend was no more. Instead, in his place, was an arrogant child who took pleasure in the pain of others. But she wasn't here to think about him. No, if she wanted to activate her quirk, she needed to look past Katsuki, past the fear and terror she'd felt, and past the longing to live she'd felt in that moment. It was only as she looked past all the emotional trauma that she was able to remember the feeling that engulfed her in the moment of her awakening. The warm feeling that suddenly came from her midsection and how rapidly it spread across her entire body. The way that warmth became painfully hot as it continued to expand within her, until her body could no longer hold it, and then it exploded. Izumi suspected that her own emotions had been the reason her quirk awakening had been catastrophic in that scenario. All she had wanted was for Katsuki to stop hurting her. Izumi quickly shook her head sideways and focused once more. She tried searching for that warmth that she had initially felt that day, before being overwhelmed by her quirk. And so the next hour passed with Izumi trying to bring about that same sensation. And then something happened. As she focused her attention inward, drowning out everything around her, a strange sensation stirred within her. She felt the familiar warmth coming from within her once more, like a tingling sensation of something just waiting to be unleashed, and a sense of something just waiting to be awakened. She focused on that warmth, touching it with her mind, and felt it react accordingly. It began to expand and spread throughout her whole body. It started as a gentle glow, a soft light emanating from the depths of her being. But as she delved deeper and deeper into this sensation, the light grew brighter and brighter, illuminating her consciousness. It was as if she had awakened a hidden wellspring, a large source of energy she couldn't even begin to describe. She could feel it pulsing within her, flowing through her body like the BLD in her veins. This time, however, the energy was not as wild and untamed as it had been on the day of her quirk awakening. No, this time it felt more like a calm river that she could influence and control. Opening her eyes, Izumi found herself in a world of absolute darkness, almost as if she had entered the void itself. And in front of her was an enormous white sphere of light, lighting up the vast darkness like the sun. She felt the familiar warmth emanating from the sphere. It was similar to the one she had felt on that day. Was this the source of her power? The reservoir of energy deep within her? Izumi cautiously walked towards the white sphere of energy, and as she did, she felt something shift within her the closer she got to it. She felt something within her resonate with the sphere, and the closer she got, she couldn't help but notice that the sphere began to pulse. Ironically, or maybe not, the manner in which it pulsed matched the rapid beating of her own heart. She stopped once she was standing right in front of the sphere. Fear and uncertainty clawed at her heart, but curiosity and excitement were just as powerful. This was her quirk, her power, and from what she understood, it was quite powerful, something that would no doubt make her a powerful hero if she managed to successfully control it. But could she control it? She was afraid of what would happen if she lost control again, how many lives she might end up endangering. No, Izumi said to herself as she closed her eyes and gathered her resolve. This is my power, I won't run away from it. The young child said firmly as she took a deep breath before opening her eyes once more and looking at the orb with a determined expression. Izumi reached out her right hand and touched the surface of the energy sphere. The effect was instantaneous. The sphere erupted into 3 separate shards that began to move and dance around Izumi's small form. the girl in awe at the myriad of colors. The first orb was vibrant green, like a lush green forest. It had a warm aura to it that Izumi was quick to recognize. It was the same warmth she felt in the park the day she awakened her quirk. She didn't know how she knew, but she could feel the promise of growth, life, and renewal that this shard offered as it danced around her. The second orb had an ominous purple color to it. The aura it emanated was cold and heavy, one that Izumi was also quick to recognize. This was the power she had unleashed on the night of the Black Plague, the power that claimed her mother's life. Just like before, she could instinctively feel its nature, the power over decay, withering, and death itself. The last shard was shimmering silver in color. Its aura was strange, different from the other two. It was an ever-shifting form of energy, one that was both chaotic and orderly. She could feel a sense of connection, one stretched far and wide, and one that made her feel small. She didn't quite know what this meant, not even instinctively. Perhaps that was because this was a part of her quirk that had yet to manifest, unlike the other two. It was something she would have to figure out if she wanted to avoid a third chaotic awakening. Before the young girl could think about it much further, the three shards of power reconverged in front of her once more, merging into one. Before, in a bright, dazzling light, the white sphere from earlier stood before Izumi once more. Its glow seemed significantly brighter than before, and Izumi felt her connection to it was much stronger than before now, that she had a decent understanding of what it was. With an audible hum and pulse of its energy, the white sphere shrunk in size before approaching Izumi. Normally the girl would have been alarmed by this. She might have even jumped back, but the young child found herself still. She wasn't scared or cautious anymore. She watched as the sphere sunk into her midsection, the familiar warmth engulfing her body once more, though stronger and more controlled than before. And then suddenly, she found herself ejected from the void she was currently in, the world around her crumbling. She opened her eyes to find herself back in the forest in the real world, in a deep breath of air. She gasped as she took in a deep breath, panting slightly at the experience that she had just gone through. That was... She had no words to describe what she had seen. There was much to interpret from that experience. She wasn't even really sure of what had just happened, but she felt she had a better understanding of her quirk because of it. It took the child a moment to realize that her body was currently glowing, a white aura similar to that of the white sphere she'd seen surrounding her body. She could feel that wellspring of energy deep within her body, the raw energy spreading through her, waiting for release under her command. She stood up from her meditative position, her body feeling lighter and stronger than it had been moments ago. Was this the effect of the power coursing through her? She wasn't sure. The more she thought she understood, the more questions she found herself having. For now, she would try something simple, calling upon the power within her and manifesting it outwardly. From what she had seen in her vision, her quirk had three aspects to it, not two like she had initially assumed. The first had something to do with life and vitality. This was the power that had manifested when she was attacked by Bakugo, the one responsible for the so-called miracle that had made the headlines. If Izumi went by what the doctor had said on the night she was admitted, then it most likely had something to do with life force energy, being able to freely manipulate for various effects, including healing and possibly attacking too. On the other hand, the second aspect was the opposite of the first. It most likely had something to do with death and destruction. She had felt that much from a shard in the vision, and it matched the reports she had matched about the Black Plague incident. She would have to be extremely careful with this particular power. It was not only dangerous, but volatile as well. Then there was the last aspect she hadn't even known about until today. She still couldn't clearly identify what it was or what it represented. She only knew that it had something to do with connections, chaos and order, balance and cycles. She had a feeling that this would be the most complex of the three aspects of her quirk, so for now she would leave it and focus on the other two. All right, let's do this. With a determined look, Izumi focused on the wellspring within her, the core of her power, and recalled the feeling she experienced when she interacted with the green shard of life and vitality within her vision. That was the aspect of her power she wished to draw out. Holding out her left hand, she slowly pulled on the wellspring, drawing on its power. She felt it respond accordingly as the energy flowed out of the wellspring, already converted into the warm and revitalizing essence of life energy. She slowly guided this energy toward her left hand, guiding it until the green glow surrounded her hand and began to leak out. Despite the excitement threatening to explode in that moment, Izumi quickly focused once more, shaping the energy as it left her body. It took a lot more conscious effort than she would have liked, but eventually she managed to achieve the desired result. Floating above the small palm of her hand was an emerald green sphere of energy. It was about the size of a tennis ball. I did it, Izumi muttered in awe and shock as she looked at the energy ball she had created with her quirk. I really did it. The girl yelled as her mouth broke into a wide smile, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. This was it, this was progress. Though there was still much to improve, such as the time it took to form the sphere and the amount of concentration required, and even how concrete the shape was, just creating something this simple had taken a great deal of effort. Despite all those flaws, Izumi was still extremely happy about this small step. It took Izumi a few moments to calm down before looking at the emerald green orb once more. As much as she wanted to test out what she could do with it, she decided to wait until she was able to make it again without too much trouble. And so, with the flex of her fingers, she cut off the flow of energy and allowed the orb to dissolve into thin air. Instead, she decided to focus on the next aspect of her quirk, the one that she found herself extremely nervous to test. She was definitely aware of what would happen if she lost control again. She could end up destroying this whole forest and everything in it. But that was why she had to do this. Sooner or later, she would have to face this power within her, and better now than later. And so, with her resolve, strengthened the child, closed her eyes once more, and focused on the wellspring deep within her. Pulling on its energy, she focused on converting it into the cold and heavy energy she had felt from the purple shard she had seen in her vision. She felt the wellspring adapt accordingly, the energy flowing out of it and into her body, changing as it became cold. Her body shivered involuntarily at the feeling, but she pressed forward, keeping her focus so as to not lose control and bring about another disaster. Like before, she channeled the power into the right hand. Izumi watched as black miasma poured out her hand. She instantly recognized it as the same thing that had been coming out her hands that night in the hospital room. As she looked at it, Izumi couldn't help but think back to that night. The black veins that appeared all over her mother's skin, the way her skin turned deathly pale, and the way the doctor suddenly announced her passing after she collapsed and stopped moving. Izumi's heart began to beat rapidly, and her breath started becoming more erratic. She could feel herself starting to lose control of herself. It took everything in Izumi not to break down right there, and a greater deal of effort to regain her senses. No, I won't let it happen again. The child screamed as she shook her head sideways rapidly. She then began to take deep breaths and let it out. It was a method of calming herself that her therapist, someone Izumi had been seeing since her mother's passing, had shown her. Recalling the instructions of her therapist, she took another deep breath before letting it out once more, her thoughts and rapidly beating heart calming down as she repeated this process a few more times. She felt control over her quirk return to her. She cut off the black miasma pouring out of her hands and instead shaped the cool energy within her into a small sphere, just like she had done before. The sphere this time, however, was not emerald green. Instead, it was a dark purple color, just like the shard she had seen within her vision. This one will take some getting used to, she muttered to herself as she cut the flow of energy entirely, allowing the dark orb to dissolve much like the emerald one. This darker aspect of her quirk was something she would have to get used to the more she used it. The cold feeling that came from it coursing through her body, the traumatic memories that were attached to it, and the fears Izumi held over the destruction this power could cause. If she ever wanted to use this power effectively, she would need to overcome these hurdles. Otherwise, they would serve as mental blocks and inhibit her ability to use her quirk at its full potential. But for now, the young hair girl was satisfied with this much. She had already made a considerable amount of progress, and the fact that she could willingly call on this power and somewhat control, it was a huge milestone for her. It was a step in the right direction, and Izumi hoped her luck would continue this way. End of flashback. After that, Izumi spent the next few months studying and practicing her quirk in secret. Due to the truth of her quirk not being realized by the public, many people who knew her were still under the assumption that her quirk allowed her to manipulate life force energy for various purposes, including mass healing and restoration. Not even her father knew the truth. Izumi had been too afraid to tell him about it, too afraid of what he would think of her once he realized that she was the one responsible for her mother's death. As a result, her quirk documentation was unknowingly falsely registered. Her father took her to see a quirk specialist a few months after the Black Plague incident. Around the same time, she had started training and practicing her quirk. They ran a few tests and asked Izumi to try and use her quirk. She made sure she only used the life aspect of it. By the end of it all, they called her Quirk Vital Force, a hybrid quirk of both emitter and mutant type. The emitter type part was quite obvious due to how she could draw and unleash energy from my wellspring, though in this case, she only showed her life energy. The mutant type part had been a bit of a surprise to Izumi, but the doctor explained that her body was adapting to the reservoir of energy, slowly becoming stronger. He also speculated that her body was absorbing energy from the environment to fuel the wellspring's growth, though the progress seemed to be rather slow, so she shouldn't expect any sudden or visible results. Regardless, the main takeaway had been that as the wellspring within Izumi continued to grow, so too would her body continue to strengthen and adapt to its power. Whether there was a limit to this or not was something the doctor couldn't confirm. All in all, even if she hadn't shown them everything, the doctor and her father both seemed in awe at her potential, telling her that she would make an amazing hero someday. Izumi wished she could have been happy under all the praise and attention that day, but knowing she was hiding a great deal about her own power and the dangers it carried prevented her from being as excited about it. Still, she wanted to live up to the potential of the power she had. If she could use this power to save lives, then she would do it. She would be a hero like All Might. She would save others with a smile on her face. July 15th, 2143. Today was her 6th birthday, a day that was usually meant to be one of celebration and jubilation for a child her age. But Izumi felt no such joy. If anything, she had been dreading this day since she became aware of its approach. After all, today marked a full year since the day her quirk awakened and a full year since her mother's passing. Despite her extremely young age, Izumi had done a lot of growing up over the last year, mainly because she had no choice but to grow up to deal with the guilt and burden she carried. The weight of her sin and the responsibility that came with her quirk was enough to force a change in any small child. Aside from that, she had also started taking more active roles in the house, doing things such as cleaning and cooking and the likes, though she still wasn't confident in her skills in cooking. This was mainly because her father spent so much time at work that he couldn't really do these things himself. And with Izumi spending more time at home, doing online classes, she often ended up being the one taking care of the house. At first it was hard, not because of how daunting the task was, but because everything she was doing reminded her of her mother. It made Izumi appreciate and miss her mother all the more. With time it got easier and became a routine for her. Get up early, clean the house, prepare breakfast, do dishes, and then go about her studies, analysis, and training. "Morning, sweetie," Hisashi said with a yawn as he walked into the living room of the apartment. Izumi was currently standing on top of a chair by the stove as she made breakfast for them. He looked around the house and noted that it was already clean and spotless, not a thing out of place. "Already up and at it, huh? You should have let me do the chores today. It is your birthday after all," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hisashi had seen the changes that had occurred within his daughter over the last year, how she had grown more mature since her mother's passing and had begun to take more responsibility within the house. Izumi made breakfast for him every morning nowadays and prepared a bento for him to take to work as well. She even left a meal ready for him to warm up when he came late from work. At first, her culinary skills left much to be desired, but that was to be expected since she had been only 5. But within weeks, she had drastically improved, and now he could proudly say he enjoyed the food she prepared for him. But still, Hisashi felt bad for the burden he was putting on her. She was cooking and cleaning on top of doing her online studies. This was a time where she should be going to elementary school, having fun with other kids, especially now that her quirk had come in. She could fit in perfectly and not have to worry about being discriminated against like before. But every time he brought up going to school, Izumi's eyes seemed to widen in fear, and her body seemed to start shaking involuntarily. Not wanting to cause her more discomfort than necessary, Hisashi allowed her to continue doing her online studies, even though he felt this isolation was also unhealthy. "Morning, Dad." Izumi greeted with a smile as she turned to him, before she shook her head sideways. "It's fine. I don't mind doing this even today. If anything, it helps keep my mind busy," Izumi added as she turned back to cooking. Hisashi could easily detect the hint of sorrow that was in her voice. He sighed as he took a seat by the table. He understood where Izumi was coming from. Part of him had been tempted to just go to work today, to drown the grief of his deceased wife and his job, and just forget about it all. But he couldn't do that to Izumi, not today of all days. He doubted they would be celebrating her birthday in any grand way. Izumi didn't seem to be in the mood for that, and neither was he if he were being completely honest. But still, the least he could do was be here for her today. "I took the day off work today," Hisashi started as Izumi placed a tray of food on the table in front of him. It was a simple yet delicious meal, steamed rice with miso soup and a small variety of vegetables along with some green tea. "I was wondering if you wanted to go to the cemetery today." Apparently, a lot of families who also lost people in the Black Plague are also going to visit their loved ones. There have even been talks about making it a commemorative event, Hisashi said as he looked at his daughter who was now seated across from him, eating her own food. Izumi seemed to freeze for a moment, a look of pain, grief, and guilt all showing on her face. Hisashi wasn't quite sure about the last one, though. Still, he wondered if bringing this up had been a good idea. Izumi had pretty much shut herself in after the passing of her mother. Hisashi couldn't even recall the last time she brought a friend over, let alone played with another kid her own age. So doing something like this might be pushing her outside her comfort zone. Sure. The child responded, much to his surprise. She seemed unsure of herself, but was still trying to put on a brave face in front of her father. "I also wanted to see Mom today anyway. I still can't believe that it's already been a year," Izumi muttered, her eyes dropping to the bowl of food in front of her as they moistened. "It still hurts, and I still miss her a lot." Hisashi's heart ached, painfully so, at those words and the expression on Izumi's face. He knew how she felt. There were times where he still found it hard to believe that his wife, the mother of his child, was no longer with them. But then he'd wake up to an empty bed, sleep alone through the night, not hear her voice welcoming him home or having her kiss him as he left for work. Then there was not seeing Inko spend precious time with Izumi. All of these small things made Hisashi realize just how empty the house had become now that Inko wasn't with them. "Me too," Hisashi responded after a moment. He couldn't help but feel he had become a bit distant from Izumi in the last month, and he knew he only had himself to blame for it. But looking at her reminded him so much of Inko. Izumi was a spitting image of her mother, and Hisashi had a feeling she would grow to be more and more like Inko as she grew. A few hours later, Hisashi and Izumi could be seen walking towards the cemetery. It was already noon, and yet the skies were dark with clouds, almost reflecting the somber atmosphere that filled the air. Izumi could almost feel the amount of grief, sadness, and death that permeated through the air as they walked into the cemetery, seeing numerous families gathered around various graves, laying down flowers, giving prayers, or even just speaking to those they had lost in the plague. Izumi dared not meet the eyes of the people they walked past as they made their way to their mother's grave, keeping her eyes to the ground and holding onto her father's hand a little more tightly. She already felt she shouldn't be here. The people and families here were coming to commemorate and remember the ones they lost 1 year ago, the people that she had killed with her quirk. What would happen if they found out that she was the one that had been responsible for that night? Surely they would blame her, maybe even call her a villain in the making. And rightfully so, too. Izumi knew she shouldn't be here, but she also wanted to visit her mother's grave. Soon enough, Izumi and Hisashi stood in front of Inko's grave, each of them holding flowers in their hands. Hisashi was the first to step forward, kneeling down to place the flowers on the grave. Izumi watched as he clasped his hands together and closed his eyes in a prayer for a second, before opening them again. "Hey Inko, sorry we haven't stopped by in a while. Work has been keeping me busier than I'd like," he started off, taking a shaky breath of air before continuing. "I can hardly believe that it's already been a year. Time seems to be moving faster than I can keep track of. And yet, despite that, every day without you hurts more than the last." The more her father spoke, the tighter Izumi clutched onto the flowers in her hands, her hair overshadowing her eyes as she looked down. She could feel, hear, and see the anguish in his voice as he continued speaking. Her own guilt and the weight of her sin become heavier and heavier with each passing second. At that moment, Izumi wanted nothing more than to run away. To run away from this place and the suffocating misery and grief that surrounded the atmosphere. Grief caused by her. She didn't know why she thought she could come here today. She wanted to see her mother's grave, but coming here had only made her feel worse. She subconsciously took a shaky step back, her body trembling slightly and tears threatening to spill from the corner of her eyes. "This is all my fault. I shouldn't have come here." Without another thought, she turned to run, only to crash into the warm embrace of someone else. "It's okay, Izumi," the person said as a pair of arms wrapped around her comfortingly. Izumi instantly recognized the voice. It was one she hadn't heard in a while, but one she wouldn't forget anytime soon. She pulled her head back to get a better look. Ani Mitsuki, Izumi shouldn't have been. As surprised by her appearance here as she was, but she was still a bit out of it. Mitsuki Bakugo, Katsuki's mother and the best friend of Izumi's mother, was a regular face in the Midoriya household, and the same can be said vice versa when Inko was alive. "Don't run away, Izumi," the elder blonde said as her embrace tightened slightly, and yet Izumi felt nothing but the warmth that only a mother could provide, a warmth that she couldn't help but lean into. "I know it hurts, and it won't stop hurting for a while, but try to remember the good memories of your mother. That's how she'd want to be remembered." Mitsuki trailed as her voice became softer towards the end. Izumi couldn't tell her that she hadn't been running from her mother's grave, but rather from the guilt of being the cause of her death. Instead, the now 6-year-old leaned into the embrace of the woman who was like a second mother to her, and allowed the warmth she hadn't felt in so long to engulf her, tears streaming from her eyes. This only caused Mitsuki to hug her tighter. Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Female Deku Had Emitter Quirk. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to ashtonkaslana for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on fanfiction.net for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.